Hello, and welcome to Season 4 of the Prima Donna podcast. I'm Nat Grant, a composer and sound artist from Melbourne, Australia. And what follows are sonic portraits of three incredible Australian artists, their voices mixed with my music. This podcast was produced on the stolen lands of the people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. The first portrait in this season is of Sue Nattrass, first female lighting designer in Australia, stage manager, operations manager at the Victorian Arts Centre, artistic director of the Melbourne and Adelaide's arts festivals, and more. She's won so many awards for her contribution to the arts in Australia that she now has several named after her. Here, she gives a brief overview of some of the many positions she's held over the years, the sexism she's faced, and the fascinating changes in technology she's witnessed for sound and lighting over the last 50 years. Let's just go, and maybe if we have a little break at some point, I'll have a listen. But the level looks good.
Good.
Yeah, you were telling me about an opening night of Chicago last week.
Yes, that was the lighting board that had a fault that they'd never seen anywhere in the world. It took them ages to find out what was wrong. They didn't believe it, the manufacturers, for a while.
And so the lighting just stopped working.
Yes, we had to finish it off with a couple of follow spots.
What year was that?
Chicago. Well, it was after I joined the Arts Centre. I guess it was the early 80s.
Yep. Probably. So you kept lighting shows after you became operations manager at the Arts Centre?
Yeah, each time. And I was at the Arts Centre too when I was asked to do the expo, which was 88, in Brisbane. There's an exhibition from the Vatican. Did I tell you about that?
No.
Oh, it's a good one. Because I went to the Vatican and walked around backstage at the Vatican. It was fantastic.
In Rome?
Mm. Oh. First class ticket, because the government were buying the tickets and they couldn't find any cheaper than the first class. I didn't care.
That's great.
As you can imagine.
Yeah, you deserve it.
I'm not telling you any more
That's fine.
at this point. But it was amazing.
Yeah.
The sense of history was extraordinary.
I like how you said backstage at the Vatican.
That's what, particularly backstage in the Sistine Chapel, where all the clothes of every pope are still hanging. So you could look through centuries of frocks, as I call them,
Yeah.
and hand-worked slippers. And I mean, the nuns that went blind over their raiment must have been numerous,
Yeah.
because they were all heavily embroidered.
Did you grow up in Melbourne?
I didn't grow up in Melbourne. I grew up on an agricultural college called Longarong, which is 8 miles out of Horsham in northwestern Victoria. A fantastic place to have a childhood. We were able to join in everything that the students who were early university age, and we could hang on to the back of practical things that they were doing if we wanted to. So we learnt a lot of skills watching. But we moved from there in 1956 to Melbourne because Dad had been promoted to the head of agricultural education and was based in Melbourne. And I was able to come out of boarding school, go become a day pupil, and likewise Kay, which was better, I think. It was an amazing year, 1956.
It's a big year in Melbourne.
Yes. We were very lucky that our father was sports mad, and he bought the tickets for all of us 2.5 years before the game started. And the opening night of the athletics was great. There was an Australian called Chilla Porter who was down to the last two of the high jumps. I think it was a Russian, the other one I can't quite remember. But I do remember that we were sitting on one side of the MCG, my brother, my sister and myself, and Mum and Dad were on the other. That's how the tickets came. And we'd agreed to meet back at the car. Well, this high jump went on and on and on, and we were sitting there saying, Mum and Dad won't have moved, they'll be watching it. And they were sitting on the other side saying, oh, the kids will be wanting to watch this, they won't have moved, so we'll wait till it finishes. And to get it finished, there were no lights at the MCG in those days, and it got into the pitch dark time.
Oh, wow.
And they brought out a couple of utes and turned their headlights on.
Is that how you became interested in lighting design?
No, I was only 14 at the time. 15. So lighting design hadn't crossed my mind, as it didn't exist as a job anyway.
Were you, in fact, the first lighting designer, first female lighting designer in Australia?
Yeah.
Both?
No, I wouldn't have been the first.
First female, first woman.
First woman.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about the other, but I'm sure about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how did that come about? Because you studied commerce at Melbourne Uni.
Well, I didn't really study commerce. That's what I was enrolled in commerce.
But you're really involved in the theatre there,
in the student theatre, yeah. And that's where I learnt a lot about everything, because the two people that ran it, ran the theatre, and the technician who was running the backstage, making sure the students didn't kill themselves or anybody else.
Yes.
The first time I went into the Union Theatre was to act, and I realised I was never going to be a great actress. Got a couple of good notices, but no, I was never going to be a great actress. And I was really interested in the technical end of it, just how things happened. And so I said, I said that to somebody from one of the dramatic societies, and they said, oh, that's good, we haven't got a stage manager, but you can do the next show. I said, oh, all right, not really knowing what a stage manager did. Because we didn't, a couple of shows that I did at school, we didn't go as far as having stage managers and things. And you end up creating the jobs.
Yeah.
And that's what happened for me, really. And the lighting design came out of having worked the lighting board at the Union Theatre, the university, and all sorts of things. I'd learned about putting on a show, really.
Yeah.
Not much about sound, because sound effects weren't used until later on. Then I did a huge sound thing for the Melbourne Theatre Company's production of Ross, which was a play about Lawrence of Arabia. It was directed by a guy called Raymond Westwell, who was a well-known English actor, director. And his wife was quite famous, Joan, I can't remember her other name. And he wanted this really complex sound, making things happen. I mean, a change in pitch on a drum would then be a change of mood, and I'd do a lighting cue there as well, and the sound cues. And it was mixing 3 tape recorders. And I mean, they were all old reel-to-reel, of course. But making the tapes was some of the really interesting things too, because the guy who was designing the sound, if you like, realised he had this happened to us, realised that he had too much work and he was trying to pass a course, and I wasn't bothering about that. And I remember taking a whole bunch of stuff home one night, and I found that I'd cut off one note of something, and I spent about 4 hours.
That's physically cut off.
Yeah, it is physically cut off. And so about 4 o'clock in the morning, after having searched through and through and through these tiny bits of tape on our dining room table, I found the right one and I was able to put it in. There was one other time I had to suddenly do something, which was Barry Humphrey's first one-man show, which was held at the Assembly Hall in Collins Street. And the same guy who was helping up with the sound was actually looking after the lighting for a commercial producer. And he suddenly realised he had an exam on the opening night. He was a bit vague.
He sounds super reliable.
Very vague. Very good at what he did, but very vague. So he said, he told the producer, and he said, well, what am I going to do? He said, it's all right, I've got a girl, she'll do it. He said, a girl? And he said, yeah, it'll be fine. And he said, okay. So I went in to do the dress rehearsal in the afternoon and then to do the opening night. And the only people in the auditorium through the dress rehearsal were his wife, Barry's wife, and me. And I thought the show was fantastic, and it was. But afterwards, Barry came sort of running out to his wife in the front row saying, I can't go on. He said, it's not funny, nobody's going to laugh, it's not funny. And he was really distressed. And that didn't ever go away from him, really, that not believing that he was funny. He struggled just about every time he went on stage for years. After I'd done things like the sound for Henry IV, the MTC started to use me, and I became fairly full-time with them, but mostly on tours. And now I have some very funny tours. The first one was with two plays, Arms and the Man and The No Hopers. The No Hopers was an Australian play. And we'd do the Arms and the Man for the kids in school, and they came because they had to. And we did the No Hopers at night. And I was playing a part in one of them, stage managing both, doing the wardrobe. I had an electrician who was Greek, and he'd never been in a theatre and never worked aboard. But he did. And I went out to look at the scenery, and there was another person there who I found out was going to be the mechanist to put it up. And it turned out he'd just come out of jail, and he said, well, how do I make these things stand up? He knew nothing. So it was a good way to begin it, my first touring job. And then the second one, so that had a fairly big cast, including Sheila Florence, who became such a legend later on. And she taught me to make sure that everything was scrupulously clean for the actors, the proper washing of the glasses, because it was set in a pub. So it had to all be very schmick, and that was a good lesson to learn. I was naive and young and stupid, I think. I was 21 when I did the Barry Humphries show.
That's incredible.
So I'd been 22 or 23, I suppose, when I did that.
Yeah.
And the second tour was hysterical. Didn't have any of those people there anyway. There was only two actors. One of them was John Sumner's wife. I think he was a bit glad that she was out of town, really. He liked a bit of a womaniser, John. And there was another guy, David, who was notoriously difficult, but he actually wasn't too bad. But so I was the stage manager, I was the lighting designer, I was the everything. I was the lighting board operator. I was the first woman board operator licensed.
Wow.
At that time in Victorian. Actually, on the first tour, the guy who drove the truck was also the mechanist, apart from this guy who's been in jail. But unfortunately, he dropped the semi-trailer on his arm, dropped the back end on his arm as he was trying to put it onto the prime mover. So he was no help at all, poor soul. He could drive, and he did manage to drive, but he couldn't do much else.
So a different time in terms of occupational health and safety.
There wasn't any.
Yeah.
Wasn't any.
But did you say you had to get a licence to operate the board?
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing.
I don't think it is anymore. I don't know. But in those days, lighting was new anyway. It was also new to everybody. The department of, whatever department it was, had to be informed and give me permission, so I had to go in and meet this bloke. And so he asked me a couple of questions. I got most of them right. I got one wrong, but he said, no, that'll be fine. So sometimes when I was hooking the lighting board up to the power supply of the town hall or whatever we were in, it kept blowing fuses. So what I would do would be get a bit of old fencing wire or anything else and put that into the fuse. Now why I didn't start a fire, I'll never know. But the shows went on. And how to hang lights when they'd never hung lights out front of house. So I'd do them off window knobs and all sorts of things. And it was a good learning curve.
And so did you see the technology change a lot over the time that you were doing that job?
Unbelievably. I mean, the lighting area moved very quickly, but then so did the staging area. But I'd worked on bigger boards than that in the Union Theatre. But that was still old technology, and I mean the board was as big as the wall of this house. You had to scoot along it and reach up and move things with your nose and with your elbows and hands and legs, and extraordinary to try and bring up a number of lights. You couldn't always get them onto masters. So that was all interesting. But then now, of course, they're about the size of a computer. And the first computerised board I got into, it had been ordered for the art centre, which was still being built. And so they said, well, why don't you take it, Sue? Because I needed it. It was for a chorus line. And you could never have done that show without a computer board. So the woman lighting designer in America, Theron Musser, was a genius with lighting. And she went and told the company to start to research and build something that she could do these things with. So that's how it happened. So that was a very different lighting thing. In fact, the stage manager, about to be stage manager in Australia of that show, A Chorus Line, both she and I went to America to see the first road show of that being set up in Boston. And that was fascinating watching that. The woman was extraordinary. She knew exactly what was happening, and as you do when you're doing a lighting. But it was a much bigger plot than any I'd ever worked on before. With that one, you had to use her lighting plot. That was contractual. Sometimes it wasn't contractual, and you could do your own. It was the same with the scenery, actually, too. But that normally had to look like it did on Broadway, which had its own drawbacks, because at times we improved on it. In fact, like Michael Bennett, who devised and directed A Chorus Line, rang me from New York one day, and he said, because he'd seen the show in Australia, and he said, how did you do that turning of the mirrors so well and so join them up much closer than they did? And I said, well, it was a very simple old method. I said, I showed the problem to our head technician, who was a marvellous guy called Johnny Machete, who never would put himself forward to say, but if you asked him, he could always find a solution. Whether we were on tour or not, if it were on tour, he'd go to his bag and get out a piece of something that he'd made and to fix it. He knew the problems that were coming, always. Anyhow, so it was really just a very simple thing called a rack and pinion that worked the cogs that turned the wheels that made the things turn round. And that probably won't make any sense to anyone unless they've seen a chorus line, so let's hope everyone who's listening to this has seen it. Yeah, so scenery changed very quickly too. And particularly, interestingly, A Chorus Line was one of those shows that if every department had to be at their best or it didn't work. So the standard of follow spot work was beyond anything we'd had here, except maybe in the old variety shows where they just winged it. But not as many cues. This had hundreds of cues and an amazing follow spot plot. When I got back to Australia, I thought, what are we going to do about follow spots? Because I knew there were none around really that were that skilled. So I put an ad in the paper for people who were interested. And I got quite a lot of things and interviewed them and chose 3 people who'd never operated a follow spot. And there was a very smart young woman, I put her in charge as the head follow spot operator. And they came in and watched rehearsals and followed the plot. This is just in the rehearsal room. And then we got to the first technical rehearsal with the cast so that they could see what they were doing. And we went through it and they didn't make a mistake. They had to learn it because there was no way they could remember what was on because they didn't have time to look at and see. And the follow spot work was fantastic, to the point that the director who came out from America, he'd been a stage manager of the original one, he said to me afterwards, he said, Sue, Theron Musser had 3 people standing by in New York with their bags packed because she didn't believe you'd be able to get people to do this. And he said it's actually better than New York. And we quite often were able to progress things because we were not first in line. We weren't producing the shows from scratch. So we could improve on things. I mean, Annie had 2 moving walkways across the front of the stage that were used for people moving in and out of scenes and some scenery. And they were set into the stage. And I went to see them set up the road tour in the workshop when they were making this. And I was asking questions, sitting there with a scrap of paper and writing notes. And they gave me the odd tip, like shave the corner off the leading edge so that it could go easily past the whatevers, So they gave me a few tips. But that's all I had to take back was what I'd seen and the odd note that I'd made. And that was the scenery everywhere. So, but there was a predecessor to me in that area, Betty Pounder, who was an extraordinary artist herself, but also an extraordinary choreographer. And when she was sent to watch the shows wherever they started, and she would have to know everything about the wardrobe, everything. She learned everything, and she'd have about 5 days backstage in wherever it was to have a look at all of those. And she'd come back and she'd know exactly all the moves for the actors, everything, because often the directors who came out they were stage managers, and there's some better stage managers directing, and there's some that are not so good. I'd like to go back to the Tivoli now, to the first day at the Tivoli, when I'd been offered this job, much to the surprise of the management of the Tivoli. I've never had a woman, big musical.
What was the show?
The Wizard of Oz, and a huge production. Still one of the biggest productions I've ever worked on, I think. about 5 weeks before it was opening, I think. 4 weeks anyway. It opened on a Boxing Day. And I remember walking in the stage door. I walked along the passage and came to this big room. I didn't know what it was. I was actually on stage, but the fire curtain was in, and it just looked like a big room, and it was empty. Now, I'd never seen a theatre that didn't have scenery on the walls or something.
Oh, funny.
There was stuff hanging around, you know. It was kept very, very clean and very tidy. In fact, around the walls, the floor would be painted white for about 3 feet, because it would show up the dirt if they weren't washing it properly. So, you know, it was a very schmick place, actually, the Tivoli. Although it was not in its heyday when I went there. It was starting to be hit by the lack of variety shows, because it was a variety house, known throughout the world as a great variety house. So here I am, I didn't know where I was. Then I suddenly realised, and I met the crew. There was about 35 of them.
Were there any other women on the crew?
No. Probably a dresser, that'd be all. But no, none in the more technical areas. None on props or on lighting or sound or anything. There was about 35 of them, and they were average age, I'd say 45. A lot of them were older. And here was this was the end of 63, this 22-year-old woman coming in, girl, and I was a girl at that age.
They must have felt terribly threatened by you.
Yeah, I suppose they did. And in fact, I was employed as an assistant stage manager because there was a stage manager. He was an old straight man to a comic, and he was dying of cancer. So he didn't do anything, obviously, so he just sat in a corner and I got the show on, and along with the staff. It was interesting, their attitude to me. For the first 2 weeks or so, they spoke in rhyming slang all the time so that I couldn't understand them, but I learnt pretty quickly what was going on. Then, once we opened, we had 3 sets of flying gear to fly the witches on, and that was guys pulling ropes in the wings, right, and watching the swing and tab tracks, and we were doing a 10 o'clock matinee or 2 o'clock matinee, then we were doing a changeover for a show at night. So we were early in the morning to do the changeovers from the night show back into Wizard of Oz. And I was getting very concerned about the fact that there was a pub across the back lane, and they used to go out for their first drinks about 9 o'clock a.m. And often by the time we were up to flying the people, they were pretty impaired. You could see the effects of the drink. And so I was pretty terrified about it. And I got to the stage where I was throwing up all the time, so I had a bucket in the prompt corner and threw up into it.
Because you were anxious?
Yes, that we could kill somebody. But there was no occupational health and safety. So eventually one bloke came up to me and he said, "What's the matter with you? You pregnant or something?" Now in 1963, you didn't ask a single woman if she was pregnant because she shouldn't have been, you know. We weren't up to the flower power time yet. Yeah. And I said, "No, I'm not pregnant." He said, "Well, what's the matter?" I said, "Well, you guys are drunk and you're pulling these ropes, and I keep thinking you might kill someone off. So, of course, I'm very concerned about it." "Oh, okay." He walked up to the back of the stage and called the rest of the staff up there, and they had a meeting about it. And they decided that it wasn't good, and that anyone seeing anyone going out the back door to go to the pub would get belted up. The person would get belted up by the others. So it was pretty rough justice. And they were fine after that. We didn't kill anybody. Although, interestingly, on New Year's Day, one of the flying things, which was actually in a tap track, fell out of the tap track. Down came Joan Harris as the good witch to the stage, and I happened to be understudying her, but I didn't, as well as the lion, I understudied.
I'm noticing a pattern here. When I read that you were a sound designer and a lighting designer and a stage manager, I didn't realise that it was always at the same time.
It's often.
And then, and you're an understudy as well. And
yeah, understudy.
Seems to.
Yeah. Oh, I went on once as an understudy a bit later on, and I saw the guy who came out from England, who was a marvellous actor, Robert. I saw him on an old post-war film the other night. He used to get a lot of films, and it's the sort of, not the stars, but the next level down. He was a lovely man. Anyway. But that same sort of pattern of being accepted was followed again in Sydney the following year when we did Wizard of Oz for the Christmas holiday period, and it sold out in both places. And one day, and we had to change over for another show at night. And we're talking a lot of scenery, big moves. And one day I came in early and at the usual time, and it was a very strange atmosphere in the theatre. And they hadn't accepted me at first. They'd heard a bit about me from the gossip, phone calls, I suppose. But they weren't accepting of me initially. But then at this time, when I came in, there was, as I said, this awful atmosphere. And I knew something was really wrong. You know how you feel it in houses sometimes? And I said to them, "What's going on, guys?" And they said, "Well, we heard Bill sack you last night." I said, "No, you didn't. He didn't sack me." He said, "Yes, we heard him sack you." I said, "No." And he said, "So we've rigged a 56-pound counterweight in this thing to drop on him and kill him." So that's how, to manage, I'm a year older, so I must have been 23, to have to manage that group of men, similar ages, put away that harebrained idea without getting them really upset or whatever. It was very interesting, good management, people management thing. It was really very interesting working in a variety house. I didn't do very many variety shows with the Tivoli, 2 or 3. But they were very different people. Comics are notoriously pretty sad people. There was a ventriloquist who was a great ventriloquist, talking through his doll, And it turned out that he fancied me, and he was standing in the prompt corner, and suddenly realised that a lot of this stuff was being directed to me, but he couldn't bear to speak to me himself. He had to do it through the doll. Okay. I mean, how odd's that?
Yeah, well...
Whatever turns you on, I suppose.
Kind of sweet. It's kind of sweet.
Yes, it is kind of sweet.
Kind of creepy.
And Jimmy Edwards, who was a comic actor, I suppose, from England, very well known, through radio shows that he did, like Take It From Here and others, that he was the top of the bill on the last night of the Tivoli when it closed down. And and it was the first show to be televised, live show to be televised. And so the television guys came in and tried to take over, of course, as they still do, I think. Yeah. And I was getting fairly resentful about it because they said, "You've got to do it to our timetable." I said, "This is a theatre of some standing around the world." And I said, "I'll be taking the curtain up at 8 o'clock. And they said, "Well, if it's 8 o'clock, that's fine." And so I thought, well, I'm going to celebrate the Tivoli. And so I stage managed the show in a long white evening frock with my mother's white fox fur and possibly a diamond necklace. I don't remember that part of it, but I got myself all duded up.
For the telly.
Yeah. And then I actually, they were able to make the cross with the curtain going up as the sweep second hand came under 8 o'clock. They didn't believe we could do any of those things, you know. They always doubted everything from other departments.
Yeah. That's a shame.
Yeah, it is. Maybe they're better about it now. I've never noticed them taking over to the same extent. Since then, I mean, I'm talking 1963, it's a long time ago. But I have to say that one of the great mentors for me was the electrician in the Tivoli, who had been a guy who was the eldest of his family, and his father died when he was about 11, and then the depression hit, and he had to find food for the 4 or 5 siblings and his mum, and he used to go out and work if he could get work on the roads, put his age up on the building of the roads, which was the Great Ocean Road, which was the big project that Sidney Meyer funded during that time. And he became a theatre electrician. And he was so good at what he did. He didn't have a ticket or anything, nothing to say. He studied anything. But he obviously must have studied in his own time, I think. But he was so good at what he did that the City Council electrical blokes often asked his opinion and asked him how to got them to help him. We had a substation in the theatre, actually. And he used to talk about the theatre, and he was just a really good man. And he was great to have, for someone of my age to have, particularly when I was dealing with some other men who were, one or two of them you couldn't put into the good basket. Mostly they were, but there was the odd. That person from the ships, when they couldn't get a gig on a ship, they'd come to the theatre because of the transferable skills of knots and ropes, and some of them were a bit wild, but interesting. It was a very interesting time for me, and I had to black out on a woman on stage once because she sat down and peed, squatted down and peed in the middle of the stage. The leading lady. It was good.
Intentionally?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
not part of the show?
No, she's quite mad.
Oh.
She was quite mad. Lots of things that to me were really quite extraordinary because I was very naive.
Yeah, very young, yeah.
Very naive too. Yeah. Anyway. Enough of those sorts of characters, but they were good characters to talk to and to get to know.
So by the time you came to the Arts Centre, what year was that?
The Arts Centre was 83.
So it's a lot later.
So, the TIV closed in 66.
Okay.
And so I didn't think I was going to get another job. I'd tried television, and they weren't hiring women in the technical area at all. And JC Williamson's had all their staff, they're fully staffed, and so was Garnet Carroll at the Princess, so there didn't seem to be any jobs around, so we were given 2 or 3 weeks' notice that we were closing down forever and that we'd have the money that we were owed, which was great. So I thought, well, I won't starve to death. And so we had the big closing night party and I went home. I was living with my parents at that time, still. And Mum rang me on Monday. I'd gone into the theatre to pack up my props and go. And she rang me on Monday and said, Williamsons are trying to get hold of you. I said, oh, really? What for? She said, I don't know, but you better ring them. And I rang, and Joe White, who was the person in charge of hiring stage management, he was an older technical person. He said, come in and see me. So I went down and walked in and he said, there's a job going. It's to be an ASM and understudy a Juve lead. And I laughed and I said, there's no way that I can do that. Look at me, there was nothing to do with the Juve lead to look at. And just at that moment, as I was beginning to say that, his phone rang and I could hear the other bloke on the other end. It was the managing director, and he said, well, what's she like? And I said, tell him she's a big girl. And he did. So that didn't happen. But then a bit later that same day, there was a show on at the Comedy which had Cookie Withers in it. Cookie and a really good Australian actor whose name escapes me. And one of the guys in the play got appendicitis. And so the stage manager was understudying him, so he had to go on, and then therefore there was nobody to stage manage. And so they asked me if I'd do it. I said, yeah, when do you want me to start? They said, tonight. Oh, I said, all right. So I went in, calling it blind, but there were not a lot of cues. No, it was not hard. It was a prompt copy that was in reasonable shape. And Ed Devereux was the name of the bloke. He and Cookie didn't always hit it off, so that was a good management thing. And her husband at that stage was managing director. There was a bit of tension could be there sometimes. But I loved her actually. She was terrific. She was very down to earth in many ways. But she was a very fine actor too. Have you ever heard of her?
I've heard the name, I don't know.
Cookie Withers. She was English, had a big career in England and a big in the movies, and then she married John McCallum, who was running Williamson's at the time. And, she had 3 kids, all of whom are in the business in some way. They're getting, the daughter's not much younger than me, in fact. And, I remember Cookie called me into her room one day and she said, how did you manage to keep standing up straight when you were so tall? Why aren't you bent over like most tall people? And I was very tall.
Especially young women too.
Yeah. And she had a daughter who was growing up and she's much taller than me. She would have been 6 feet, I would have thought. And I said, well, all I can remember is when we were walking down the street in Horsham on Fridays, which we used to do with Mum, doing the weekly shopping. People would stop her and say, that's Sue, isn't she tall? And Mum would say, yes, isn't it wonderful? And so that was all she had to do.